Donald J. Trump's birthday is 14 June. People have many reasons why they're not celebrating his birthday. Which of these reasons are yours? My name is Scott, an expat and early retiree who left America because of Donald Trump when he bombed Iran without congressional approval in 2025. Here might be your reasons for not celebrating. Let me know in the comments what your reasons are for not celebrating, and why you think America and the world deserve better as we walk through the streets of my temporary home as an expat currently in Vlorë, Albania. Soleimani assassination. 2020 ordered the targeted killing of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, drawing criticism for escalating Middle East tensions without prior legislative consultation. Syrian Kurdish withdrawal. 2019 abruptly pulled U.S. troops from northern Syria, which critics asserted abandoned key Kurdish allies. JCPOA withdrawal. 2018 exited the Iran nuclear deal, a move opponents claimed removed essential verification guardrails and allowed Iran to advance its nuclear enrichment capabilities. Open Skies Treaty exit. 2020 withdrew the U.S. from the Surveillance Flight Treaty, which critics argued reduced transparency and intelligence sharing with European allies. INF Treaty withdrawal. 2019 terminated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia, leading critics to warn of a renewed global missile arms race. Strained NATO relations. Repeatedly questioned the value of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which opponents claimed weakened the Western Security Alliance. Human Rights Report. Scaling. Shortened and scaled back annual State Department human rights reports, removing specific references to systemic corruption and gender-based crimes. Alignment with authoritarian leaders. Praised controversial foreign leaders, which critics argued undermined America's historic role as a global champion for democratic values. Balkans policy friction. Pursued parallel diplomatic tracks in the Balkans that critics noted created diplomatic tension with the European Union. Immigration and Border Enforcement Family Separation Policy. 2018 implemented a zero-tolerance border policy resulting in thousands of migrant children being separated from their parents, drawing global humanitarian condemnation. The Muslim travel ban. 2017 issued executive orders restricting entry from several Muslim-majority nations, which opponents argued was discriminatory and damaged America's global image. DACA rescission attempt sought to terminate the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, a move critics said created intense legal and personal instability for hundreds of thousands of young immigrants. Public Charge Rule. 2019 tightened regulations to deny green cards to immigrants utilizing public assistance, which opponents argued penalized vulnerable families. Border wall funding diversion. Used emergency declarations to divert billions from the military budget to construct a southern border wall, which critics termed an evasion of Congress's power of the purse. Title 42. Expulsions. Utilized public health authority during the pandemic to swiftly expel asylum seekers, drawing heavy criticism from human rights organizations. Reductions in refugee caps slashed the annual U.S. refugee admission ceiling to historic lows, which critics argued abandoned a traditional American humanitarian commitment. Enhanced ICE detentions expanded the categories of undocumented immigrants targeted for deportation, which critics argued spread fear through immigrant communities. Restricting benefits for legal status introduced policies blocking certain individuals with lawful immigration status from accessing baseline health and food assistance. Asylum access restrictions enacted rules requiring asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their cases were processed, exposing them to dangerous conditions according to humanitarian groups. Healthcare and Public Health Affordable Care Act (ACA) sabotage. Reduced ACA enrollment periods and eliminated federal advertising budgets, which critics claimed artificially depressed health exchange enrollment. COVID-19 pandemic management disseminated conflicting public messaging on safety measures and treatments, which public health experts argued hindered a unified federal pandemic response. World Health Organization withdrawal. 2020 initiated the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization during a global pandemic, a move critics said harmed global health coordination. Elimination of NSC Pandemic Unit 2018. Dissolved the National Security Council's Global Health Security Team, which opponents argued left the nation unprepared for the coronavirus crisis. Short-term health plan expansion. Expanded skimpy short-term insurance plans that critics labeled junk insurance due to their lack of consumer protections for pre-existing conditions. Medicaid work requirements allowed states to impose work mandates for Medicaid, which critics noted led to thousands of low-income individuals losing health coverage. Medicaid funding shifts proposed structural budget changes that shifted costs directly onto states, which critics argued eroded safety net healthcare infrastructure. Reproductive health care restrictions reimposed the global gag rule and altered Title X funding, which critics claimed cut off low-income women from essential reproductive health care. CDC guidance interference, accused of pressuring the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to alter scientific reports to fit political narratives during the pandemic. Rising uninsured rates implemented healthcare cutbacks that policy analysts linked to the first increase in the number of uninsured Americans in a decade. Economy, taxation, and tariffs. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, 2017. Enacted a major tax overhaul that critics argued disproportionately benefited corporations and the wealthy, while adding nearly $2 trillion to the national debt. Broad steel and aluminum tariffs imposed heavy global tariffs on metal imports, which critics claimed raised production costs for American manufacturers and led to retaliatory tariffs. Trade war with China initiated a protracted tariff dispute with Beijing that economists argued burdened American consumers and severely harmed domestic agricultural exporters. Exclusion from the child tax credit enacted second-term tax priorities that critics argued excluded millions of low-income children from benefiting from tax credit increases. Federal debt acceleration oversaw a significant spike in the national debt driven by a combination of tax cuts and emergency pandemic spending. Weakening of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, appointed leadership that scaled back enforcement actions, which consumer advocates argued left borrowers vulnerable to predatory lending. Rollback of the fiduciary rule canceled a regulation requiring financial advisors to act in their clients' best financial interests, which critics said harmed retirement savers. Agricultural subsidy disparities distributed billions in bailout funds to offset trade war damages, which watchdogs noted disproportionately benefited large corporate farms over small family operations. Opposition to federal minimum wage increases resisted efforts to raise the federal minimum wage, which labor advocates argued suppressed real wages for low-income workers. Regressive tariff impacts implemented second-term tariff strategies that economists argued functioned as a regressive tax, raising the cost of everyday consumer goods. Environment and climate change. Paris Climate Agreement withdrawal pulled the U.S. out of the international accord, which environmental scientists argued undermined global efforts to curb carbon emissions. Clean Power Plan rescission replaced Obama-era power plant emission limits with the weaker Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which critics stated would increase air pollution. Waters of the United States rollback redefined federal water protections to exclude many streams and wetlands, a move critics warned jeopardized drinking water purity. Vehicle fuel economy rollbacks weakened federal fuel efficiency standards for cars and light trucks, which environmental groups argued would increase gasoline consumption and carbon output. Opening the ANWR to drilling approved oil and gas leasing in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, drawing strong opposition from conservationists and indigenous groups. Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante reductions substantially downsized two massive national monuments in Utah, which critics termed a blow to public land preservation. Weakening the Endangered Species Act altered regulations to allow economic factors to be considered before protecting threatened species, which biologists argued accelerated biodiversity loss. Methane emissions deregulation. Rescinded rules requiring oil and gas companies to monitor and fix methane leaks, accelerating the release of a potent greenhouse gas, according to scientists. Sidelining climate science. Removed climate change data from various federal agency websites and restricted government scientists from presenting climate research. Stream protection rule repeal overturned a regulation preventing coal mining companies from dumping debris into local streams, which critics noted degraded Appalachian waterways. Civil rights, justice, and governance judicial hyperpartisanship appointed a large number of deeply conservative federal judges, which critics argued tilted the judiciary into a highly politicized branch of government. Pardons for political allies, issued high-profile executive clemency to political loyalists and individuals convicted of war crimes, which critics asserted eroded the rule of law. Voting rights opposition. Frequently challenged mail-in voting mechanisms and supported stricter state-level voting restrictions, which civil rights groups argued disenfranchised voters. Transgender military ban. Prohibited most transgender individuals from serving in the U.S. Armed Forces, a policy critics labeled as discriminatory and harmful to military readiness. Federal workforce executive orders attempted to reclassify tens of thousands of civil servants under Schedule F to make them easier to fire, which critics called an assault on a merit-based federal bureaucracy. Withholding federal funding attempted to delay and withhold appropriated public funding to bypass congressional approval on specific programs. Dismantling federal agencies pursued structural changes aimed at reducing the operational capabilities of various federal safety net and regulatory bodies. Deployment of federal law enforcement dispatched federal agents to cities like Portland during civil unrest, which local officials argued escalated violence and violated civil liberties. Weakening of DOJ consent decrees restricted the Department of Justice's use of court-enforceable agreements to reform police departments accused of systemic misconduct. Limiting Title IX protections altered federal guidance on campus sexual assault, which advocates argued reduced protections for victims and discouraged reporting. Social safety net and public assistance, SNAP benefit structural reductions, enacted major structural overhauls and historic budget cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, including the suspension of certain SNAP benefits. Tightening housing assistance, advanced policies that reduced available housing assistance for vulnerable populations, including formerly homeless individuals. Ignoring housing discrimination, scaled back enforcement of the Fair Housing Act's disparate impact standard, which civil rights groups argued weakened protections against systemic housing bias. Public assistance data weaponization implemented data sharing practices across agencies that critics claimed created fear and confusion among immigrant families seeking legitimate assistance. Work requirements. For TANF, encourage stricter work mandates for temporary assistance for needy families, which social policy researchers argued kicked vulnerable families off baseline support. Social Security Disability Review increases proposed rules to increase the frequency of eligibility reviews for disability beneficiaries, which advocates argued created unnecessary administrative hurdles for the disabled. Weakening of the Emergency Food Assistance Program implemented supply chain adjustments that critics argued caused periodic disruptions at local food banks. Reductions in low-income home energy assistance propose consecutive budget cuts to a program that helps low-income households pay heating and cooling bills. Restricting overtime pay rules implemented a weaker federal overtime rule than previously proposed, leaving millions of workers ineligible for overtime pay, according to labor groups. Excluding mixed-status families from COVID relief, signed emergency relief packages that initially blocked stimulus checks from reaching U.S. citizens married to undocumented immigrants. Education and labor. Public school funding reductions. Proposed consecutive federal budgets aimed at slashing public school programs while diverting public funds toward private school voucher initiatives. Rollback of borrower defense rules weakened regulations designed to forgive federal student loans for students defrauded by predatory for-profit colleges. Rescission of gainful employment regulations repealed a rule that cut off federal funding to higher education programs whose graduates consistently failed to earn enough to pay back student loans. Weakening of OSHA enforcement reduced the number of workplace safety inspectors, which labor unions argued directly led to unsafe conditions for industrial and frontline workers. Joint employer standard modification altered rules to make it harder for franchised workers to hold parent corporations accountable for labor violations, a shift critics argued harmed labor rights. Undermining public sector unions appointed members to the National Labor Relations Board who rolled back rules protecting workers' rights to organize and bargain collectively. Tip pooling rule alterations proposed rules allowing employers to control and redistribute workers' tips, which labor advocates warned could lead to wage theft. Limiting protections for gig workers issued guidance classifying gig economy workers as independent contractors, denying them federal minimum wage and overtime protections. Sidelining the Department of Education Civil Rights Office scaled back the scope of investigations into systemic discrimination and racial disparities within public school systems. Promoting for-profit colleges reversed restrictions on the for-profit college sector, which watchdogs argued exposed students to low-quality degrees and high debt loads. Science, Technology, and Infrastructure Net Neutrality Repeal 2017 supported the FCC's decision to eliminate net neutrality rules, which open internet advocates argued allowed ISPs to block or throttle online content. Unfulfilled infrastructure commitments repeatedly promised a comprehensive national infrastructure bill that never materialized during his first term, leaving roads and bridges to degrade further. Suppression of scientific research delayed or altered federal reports on topics ranging from chemical safety to endangered species to align with industrial interests. Sidelining environmental impact assessments altered the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, to fast-track infrastructure projects by bypassing thorough environmental reviews. Restricting scientific advisory committees cut the number of federal scientific advisory panels and removed independent academic scientists in favor of industry representatives. Digital privacy rollbacks signed legislation allowing internet service providers to sell users private browsing histories without explicit consent. Defunding renewable energy R&D proposed significant budget cuts to the Department of Energy's renewable energy and energy efficiency research arms. Slowing rural broadband deployment implemented administrative shifts that critics argued delayed funding allocations meant to close the digital divide in rural communities. Politicization of weather forecasts, Sharpiegate, intervened in official National Weather Service forecasts to align with a political statement, which critics noted undermined trust in public safety alerts. Restrictions on scientific grants implemented ideological screening processes for certain federal research grants, causing a chilling effect within the academic community. Democratic institutions and democratic norms unsubstantiated election claims, repeatedly claimed without evidence that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, which critics argue severely degraded public faith in American democracy. January 6th, Capitol attack escalation, delivered a speech preceding the breach of the U.S. Capitol, an event critics and lawmakers characterized as an unprecedented assault on the peaceful transfer of power. Labeling the free press as the enemy of the people, frequently used hostile rhetoric against news organizations, which press freedom advocates argued incited threats against journalists. Defying congressional subpoenas instructed administration officials to ignore lawful oversight subpoenas, which critics noted weakened the constitutional system of checks and balances. Undermining intelligence agencies publicly disputed the consensus findings of U.S. intelligence agencies regarding foreign election interference, favoring statements from adversarial leaders instead. Politicizing the Department of Justice publicly pressured attorneys general to investigate political opponents and drop charges against allies, which critics argued compromised the DOJ's independence. Abuse of the National Emergency Declaration used emergency declarations to bypass congressional spending blocks, setting what legal scholars termed a dangerous executive precedent. Retaliation against whistleblowers Publicly targeted and reassigned government whistleblowers who reported administration misconduct, which watchdogs argued discouraged ethical oversight. Violations of the Hatch Act staged highly political campaign events on federal property, including the White House, which critics noted ignored laws separating governance from campaigning. Hostility toward independent inspectors. General fired or replaced multiple internal agency watchdogs investigating administration spending and management practices, reducing independent oversight. Veteran affairs and defense privatization of veterans' health care expanded the VA Choice Program, which critics argued diverted billions of dollars away from underfunded VA hospitals into the private medical sector. Diversion of military family funds, relocated funds earmarked for military housing improvements and base schools to pay for border security projects. Pardoning of convicted war criminals, granted executive clemency to service members convicted of battlefield misconduct, which military leaders argued damaged military discipline and the global reputation of the U.S. Armed Forces. Withholding veteran disability benefits. Instituted administrative processing delays for veterans seeking compensation for chronic exposure to toxic burn pits. Agriculture and rural communities. Abolishing the GIPSA protections. Rolled back the grain inspection, packers and stockyards administration rules, which family farm advocates argued left small-scale livestock producers defenseless against predatory meatpacking monopolies. Delaying Farm Bill assistance, tied up disaster relief and baseline farm subsidy payments in bureaucratic red tape during critical planting seasons. Loosening meatpacking safety standards allowed poultry and swine processing plants to increase line speeds, which labor advocates noted led to a spike in worker injuries and severe food safety risks. Limiting rural development grants. Cut funding for rural infrastructure programs focused on clean drinking water and wastewater treatment systems. Bypassing small refinery exemptions, granted waivers to large oil companies from biofuel blending mandates, which corn farmers argued severely depressed domestic ethanol demand. Consumer protection and corporate oversight. Disbanding the Fair Lending Unit stripped the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's enforcement division of its power to independently investigate discriminatory lending patterns. Weakening auto loan protections revoked federal guidance aimed at preventing auto lenders from charging minority buyers higher interest rates. Allowing predatory payday lending rescinded a rule requiring short-term payday lenders to verify a borrower's ability to repay before issuing high-interest loans, eviscerating Equifax penalties. Reduced the federal regulatory fines and accountability measures following the massive data breach that exposed the private data of over 140 million Americans. Suspending corporate fraud investigations. Directed federal enforcement agencies to deprioritize white-collar crime investigations, resulting in a historic low for corporate prosecutions. Civil rights and equal protection, rescinding transgender school guidance, overturned federal guidelines that allowed transgender students to use public school bathrooms matching their gender identity. Limiting civil rights data collection, stopped requiring large companies to report wage data broken down by race and gender, which civil rights groups argued masked systemic pay gaps. Abolishing the equal pay rule, blocked an initiative intended to close the gender wage gap by increasing transparency in federal contract bidding. Restricting diversity training, issued an executive order banning federal agencies and contractors from conducting diversity, equity, and inclusion training. Weakening language access for immigrants, reduced funding for translation services at federal offices, making it harder for non-English speakers to navigate the legal and healthcare systems. Public lands and heritage opening boundary waters to mining, lifted a moratorium on copper-nickel mining near the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, threatening a pristine watershed. Fast-tracking the Keystone XL pipeline, bypassed local environmental reviews and indigenous land rights to approve the construction of a controversial oil pipeline. Expanding offshore drilling, proposed opening nearly all U.S. coastal waters to offshore oil and gas drilling, drawing fierce opposition from coastal governors of both parties. Commercial fishing and marine monuments opened the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument to commercial fishing, harming fragile deep-sea ecosystems. Selling public lands for nominal fees altered Bureau of Land Management rules to allow oil and gas leases on public lands to be auctioned off for as little as $2 an acre. Postal Service and voting infrastructure, decommissioning mail sorting machines, oversaw the removal of hundreds of high-volume postal sorting machines ahead of major elections, which critics argued intentionally slowed down mail delivery. Eliminating post office overtime, implemented cost-cutting measures at the USPS that banned overtime for postal workers, resulting in massive backlogs of prescription medications and bills. Blocking emergency USPS funding, repeatedly rejected emergency federal bailouts for the Postal Service during peak operational crises. Dismantling the Election Assistance Commission attempted to defund the federal agency responsible for securing voting machines against foreign cyber attacks. Purging voter registration lists supported aggressive state-level strategies to erase millions of infrequent voters from active registration rolls. Labor standards and workplace safety exempting large employers from injury reporting rolled back a requirement for large businesses to electronically submit detailed workplace injury logs to OSHA. Limiting child labor protections, proposed rules allowing younger workers to operate hazardous machinery in healthcare settings and agricultural zones. Allowing management to keep tips, approved a rule allowing restaurant managers to participate in employee tip pools, which labor unions warned would facilitate wage theft. Restricting union access to federal spaces, evicted federal employee unions from their designated on-site offices, hindering their ability to represent workers in grievance disputes. Slashing mine safety inspections. Reduce the frequency of mandatory underground safety audits at coal mines, which safety advocates linked to preventable mining accidents. Public transparency and ethics concealing visitor logs. Stopped public release of the White House visitor logs, a move watchdog groups asserted hid the influence of corporate lobbyists on federal policy. Bypassing Senate confirmation, utilized an unprecedented number of acting cabinet secretaries to run major federal agencies, avoiding the constitutional requirement for Senate vetting. Ignoring the emoluments clause, continued to profit from foreign government spending at personal hotels and resorts while serving in office, creating significant conflicts of interest. Annulling the lobbying ban, revoked a rule that prohibited former administration officials from lobbying their former agencies for 5 years after leaving government. Suppressing government data, altered or hid economic data regarding the negative long-term impacts of tariffs on American manufacturing jobs. And of course, this doesn't list his other crimes and misdemeanors, or his full role in the Epstein controversy, his threats to Greenland and Denmark, Canada, or Cuba, or his attack on Venezuela, his limiting permanent residency applications, his tariffs, the cost and burden to Americans and the world, and him saying that they don't matter to him, or him ignoring or outright lying about human-caused global climate change. He doesn't accept that his policies raise the prices of nearly everything. The point is that he doesn't care, and why don't more people see that yet? Everything he does, whether adding his name to the Kennedy Center, or the impact an unprovoked and unexplained war on Iran, the elimination of USAID, the deaths of Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good, the divisive texts, memes, and AI images spreading culture and political polarization and divisiveness, or turning the White House lawn into an arena blood sport like a Roman emperor in a declining nation with nothing else to show for itself. It's all about a man who cares more about himself than the world he inhabits, and an idled mind and body, whether by age or choice. He doesn't care about you or me, and that's what I tried to display in this video. When a person forgets the world he inhabits, what does that say about the man? No man is an island, and certainly not the President of the United States. What else did I forget? More to come. After all, the man breaks the rules every day, so there's so much more to discover. Thank you for watching and walking with me, and please remember to let me know in the comments which reason you have not to celebrate this tyrant's birthday.